The first reading this morning is from Luke, the 7th chapter. One of the Pharisees invited Jesus to dinner. Jesus went to his house and reclined at table. A woman who had a low reputation in that town came to the house. She had learned that Jesus was dining with a Pharisee, so she brought with her an alabaster jar of perfumed oil. She stood behind Jesus, crying, and her tears fell on his feet. Then she dried his feet with her hair, kissed them, and anointed them with oil. When the Pharisee saw this, he said to himself, "If this fellow were the prophet, he'd know who this woman is that is touching him, and what a low reputation she has." In answer to the Pharisee's thoughts, Jesus said, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. Two people owed money to a creditor. One owed the creditor the equivalent of 2 years' wages, the other 2 months' wages. Both were unable to pay, so the creditor wrote off both debts. Which of them was more grateful to the moneylender? Simon answered, "I suppose the one who owed more." Jesus said, "You are right." Turning to the woman, he said to Simon, "See this woman? I came into your house and you gave me no water to wash my feet, but she has washed them with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss of greeting, but she covered my feet with kisses. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet with oil. For this reason, I tell you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. See how much she loves? But the one who is forgiven little loves little." Then Jesus said to the woman, "Your sins are forgiven." Those also sitting at the table began to ask among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Meanwhile, Jesus said to her, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace."
Our second reading this morning comes from the Samaññaphala Sutta of Buddhism. There are 5 impediments and hindrances, overgrowths of the mind that stultify insight. What 5? Sensual desire is an impediment and hindrance, an overgrowth of the mind that stultifies insight. Ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and remorse. Skeptical doubt are impediments and hindrances, overgrowths of the mind that stultify insight. Without having overcome these 5, it is impossible for a monk whose insight thus lacks strength and power to know his own true good, the good of others, and the good of both. Nor will he be capable of realizing that superhuman state of distinctive achievement, the knowledge and vision enabling the attainment of sanctity. But if a monk has overcome these 5 impediments and hindrances, these overgrowths of the mind that stultify insight, then it is possible that, with his strong insight, he can know his own true good, the good of others, and the good of both. And he will be capable of realizing that superhuman state of distinctive achievement, the knowledge and vision enabling the attainment of sanctity. And our final reading is from Joni Mitchell and her song Woodstock. We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon. We are golden, caught in the devil's bargain, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Ancient and recent words from many traditions for our present day understanding.
Well, thank you all again for spending the morning with us. It may be evening for some of you when you read it, or later in the week, but this particular gathering is so important for those of us on staff who miss you all, and sometimes can lose, the sense of being ministers when everything's by phone or by computer. So it's still digital and it's still virtual, but it feels really good to see real faces. So thank you so much for setting aside this particular time. Today, we're talking about a very difficult subject, and that's the subject of sin, and how Jesus understood that, and how Buddha talked about something like that. And my approach is tainted by the fact that some of the cruelest things I've ever heard said were by people who had a Bible in their hand. There are people who religion becomes a kind of trap, and you talk to them and it's like everything's like a little mousetrap. Like they never just communicate with you. They're always laying little traps to catch you in something where they can convert you to whatever their particular position is. I've always secretly thought of them as spankers for Jesus, that they have taken upon themselves the task of disciplining everybody else. And you wonder how somebody gets to that sad state. As a minister, I really quickly realized that the people who do that, the moralists, the people who sit in judgment of other people, what you see in that person is usually the tip of a very perverted iceberg, that they themselves live in emotional chaos and have very complicated ethical lives, sometimes very compromised, and they believe in a judgmental God. They want to be perfect, but they can't because they're human. And so they try to address and pacify this judgmental God by sitting as the guardians of the universe in terms of moral. They can't control the storms of desire within their own hearts, but they think that God will forgive them if they can discipline other people. And you know people aren't happy when they do that. You know that you're not happy when you're being a creep to other people, that it's a certain stuntedness coming from pain, from self-loathing. There was a song years ago that kind of gets that sense of self-contempt by Carly Simon. She said, "My friends from college, they're all married now. They have their houses and their lawns. They have their silent noons, tearful nights, angry dawns. Their children hate them for the things they're not. They hate themselves for what they are. And yet they drink, they laugh, close the wound, hide the scar." And I feel a lot of people are trying to do that with religion. And that's why I think Jesus talked about forgiveness a whole lot more than he spoke about righteousness. That when we get in that trap, we're already there because we hate ourselves, because we're afraid. And so spanking the spankers isn't going to solve this problem. Criticizing the criticizers, you can't make these people feel any worse about themselves than they already do. So what's needed is not to fight the problem, but to heal it. Not to try to counter with a greater righteousness, but instead to overcome this fear, this bitterness, this anger with compassion. The idea of sin has been used to hurt people and judge people, and that's a very negative thing, and I think religion needs to get past that. At the same time, there's something wrong about the world. There's a fundamental disorientation to nature, to life, and it's not because we're bad. Genesis tells the story that we were created in a garden. And again, this is a poem. It's an allegory. Adam and Eve weren't particular people, I don't think, but all of us, some part of us was born into this beautiful gift of the earth. And in the story, the first two kids that come along, one of them is sort of an indigenous, lives with the land, and the other becomes a farmer and starts tilling the soil. And that's close, but it's a step away from harmony with nature. And he becomes jealous of the indigenous brother, and taking up the first colonizing mind, kills his brother. Then one step after another step through the book of Genesis, they decide that if we can have farming, then we need to protect our profits, and therefore we need violence. We need a ruler. And to watch over the ruler, we need temples. And all along the way, God is saying, no, I don't need a king. No, I don't need a temple. The earth is your temple. So there's a sense in which religion and government are necessary evils. And Genesis recognizes that. It's not trying to say, go live out in the woods again, but to realize that the closer we can get to the earth, the more time we can spend in compassion, the more time we spend in our own human hearts. And the further we drift away from that, the more we fall into self-loathing and cruelty. The word for sin in Hebrew, there's actually at least 72 different concepts. And unfortunately, Christianity translates that with one word. And that's a very crude instrument. It's like trying to draw the Grand Canyon with two Crayolas. You know, it's a whole lot more complicated than that. And it breaks that binary view of good versus evil, becomes a real trap for people. You've heard the old spiritual story of somebody fell off a cliff and then somebody else says, well, that's terrible. And then the teacher says, no, it's not terrible. They fell into a haystack. They said, oh, that's good. And they said, no, there was a pitchfork in there. And they said, oh, that's bad. And he goes, no, the wounded the leg, you know, it's a good thing the leg got wounded and the guy didn't march off to war and get killed. And you make up the details of the story and go as long as you want to. But the point is, we're not really clear what's good and evil. And if you look at Genesis carefully, there's two trees in the garden. And God isn't saying not to get smart by saying, don't eat the fruit of good and evil. It's saying, don't live in your judgments about life before you live in life. Eat from the tree of life first, and then your discernment will make sense. Because if not, then your judgments become the obstacle or the hindrance to living fully and completely. And that's what sin is in Judaism, Christianity, and in Buddhism. Excuse me. It's realizing that things aren't the way they should be. And you can't just blame the individuals. It's bigger and more complicated than that. But learning about it isn't shameful. It's becoming artful. When I was a kid, we had a pool table, and it was a real cheap pool table. And so it began to sag really quickly. And it had little mountains on it and little valleys and stuff. So whenever I played, I could beat much, much better pool players because I knew where the valleys were and where the hills were. I knew I was working with a warped surface, and so I could work around that. And that's a lot, I think, of what the spiritual teachers are trying to get us to do. Recognize that our instincts don't work in the world. They were evolved for a different setting, much more simple, much more natural. We were born into systems that are racist and sexist. And even, even though we hate that, we find ourselves playing a role in it. So what they're trying to do is not make us feel shame, but to help us find our way home again. And that's why I included the wonderful verse from Joni Mitchell, which I think is Genesis in a nutshell. It was written to Woodstock. She wasn't able to be at Woodstock, but she wrote the anthem for Woodstock. I came upon a child of God. He was walking along the road, and I asked him, where are you going? And this he told me: I'm going down to Yarsbrick's farm, going to join a rock and roll band, going to camp out on the land and get my soul free. Then can I walk beside you? I've come here to lose the smog, and I feel myself a cog in something burning. Okay, that's our modern situation. This is her refrain. We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon. We are golden, but we're caught in the devil's bargain, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. I think that's sort of the punchline of a lot of these Genesis stories. And it's a little bit clearer. I think each of the world's religions have a strength and weakness, and that learning all of them helps us appreciate any one of them bit better. But I think Buddhism, of all the world's religions, is probably the most sophisticated psychologically. They deal much more with mental states and the mind, and how we can do things. And they talk about the 5 hindrances, which are very much like our the 7 deadly sins, but they're seen almost from a counseling point of view. Lust is not desire is not a problem, but there's an overgrowth of the thinking part of us that can turn desire into lust, where we can look at other people as objects, and we get stuck in a kind of quagmire then. So it's not that we're evil. It's the hindrances are kind of like mesquite trees that grow and keep the bigger plants from growing. They're parts of ourselves that are not evil in themselves, but they keep us from being as compassionate and loving as we can possibly be. We get stuck in them. There's also in Buddhism, they talk about skandhas, which are also, it starts SK, it's how it's spelled. And those are more particular how we fall out of wholeness and completeness. I don't have time. This sermon wound up being a lot longer than I was wanting it to be. So I'm not giving Buddha as much time as I would love to. But it's very easy to look those things up. And I think you'll find Buddhism to be incredibly helpful in understanding mental states and emotional states and this kind of thing. But I think the point in all of this, of Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, is that there are frailties of the human condition that are just there. If we get to know them, they can be our teachers. But if not, we project them on other people. And then we become the problem. We see through our own brokenness, our alienation, what they would call sin. And we look at other people and we project that all on them. And that's what our lesson, our little story today is about. A person who's trying to be pure, and he looks at a woman and confuses his own desires with her morals and ethics. But we have to approach this with grace, with kindness, or else we become subhuman. And trying to be more than human, we become subhuman. It's like when you have an aquarium. If you ever try to get the water completely clean and clear and pure, you just killed all the fish, right? There's a murkiness that's necessary for biological lives, and we are no different. So anyway, Jesus tells this story. Or I guess Luke is telling the story where it's called a Pharisee, but it's very important to realize this is not a criticism of Judaism. We have to, whenever we read the Bible, we need to realize that the problem here is the person is a purist. And that can make us cruel before we know it. There was a saying about the American Puritans and the English Puritans that the reason they were against bear baiting was not that it hurt the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the observers. That when we try to be pure, the life force within us becomes an embarrassment. And we have to approach ourselves with a tremendous amount of grace and forgiveness before we can do that for other people. So you have this person who's very purist, but he's very repressed. And the way the Greek reads, the order of the words are very important in Greek. And basically it says, behold a woman. And it doesn't give her name, and she doesn't have any lines. And in a way, it doesn't matter because this guy didn't see in her anyway. Apparently, she was an attractive person. And she may have been one of the many, many women who were forced into prostitution, not through a weakness within themselves, but because the patriarchal culture gave no options. You were either linked to a man or you were on your own. And a woman who either lost her spouse or was kicked out, or, it was horrifying. If she had children to feed, for many women, the only avenue was prostitution. So we don't know any of the details of this woman. And it's a mistake to think this is Mary Magdalene. We don't know who this woman is. And I think that's part of the point, because Simon is not seeing, this purist is not seeing the human being in front of him. He's seeing his own reaction to his own stuff. He's focused on her exposed ankles. He's maybe he thinks her neckline is too low, or her hair is too long, or who knows what it takes. But he's seeing his own perversion, not hers. And she comes, she sees this compassionate teacher who has seen her possibly as a human being. Maybe that's where this gratitude is coming from, the one man who can see her as a human being. And she falls on her knees and starts kissing his feet, which is like the worst nightmare of this purist, Simon. All of his own desires come to the surface, and he's trying not to experience that. He's trying not to have that inside of himself. And the word that's used there means to repeated kiss. So to poor Simon, it's like she's making out with Jesus' feet, and he is as uncomfortable as he could be. So Jesus then says, let me tell you a parable. And that's when Simon, if he'd been smart, would have run out of the house. Because whenever Jesus did that, he was about to give you a glimpse into a side of yourself you don't want to see. The parable is a skillful means to teach us to get around our own defenses of who we are. Very often, that's what that is. So he said that two people owed a judge money, or creditor money. And the creditor forgave them both. Which of them do you think loved more? And like a good weaselly word kind of response, Simon says, well, I suppose, I figure he can't just say that Jesus is right. But all he's got are mouse traps. He's trying to trap people so that his religion works. And Jesus isn't cooperating. So he says, you're right, that whoever loves more, has accepted forgiveness more, has been healed more. We've all made terrible mistakes. We're all part of systems of evil that we wouldn't choose, but we can't get out of them. But since I came to this house, you've basically treated me like a stranger. You didn't anoint my head with oil. She's kissed my feet. She's anointed me. And what the listeners of the time would see in this is she's anointing him with myrrh, which is a funeral ointment. So to the listener at the time, this woman who's been rejected by all of these men, who's been seen as a sinner or a prostitute, is the one who anoints Jesus for the crucifixion. That would have been very powerful in the day. And I think the punchline is, if the word for sin means to miss the mark, that's the Greek word that tries to capitulate all the 72 meanings of the Hebrew thought. Some of it's your fault, some of it's not, some of it's personal, some of it's social. But the bullseye, the target that we're aiming for, is not righteousness, but love, but compassion. If we don't know that, we're lost. And our efforts to become pure then take us further and further away from our own hearts. We hate ourselves more and more. We're ashamed of ourselves more and more. And we more and more pretend to be what we're not. And so we stop trying to get better ourselves and start trying to live everybody else's life. In Genesis, it's you start in the garden and you kind of drift away from that. It's not your fault. You're part of the human story. You're born into it in many ways. But that's not all you can be. You can get back to your own heart. That's what Genesis is trying to say. And then in Buddhism, you're surrounded by these little shrubs that are robbing you of your energy, that rob you of your greatness. But if you can look at them with affection and with understanding, they can become skillful means to make you even more compassionate for others with the same problems. But in all of this, any way that we look at it, the important thing is that the notion of sin is not to make us feel bad about ourselves, but to realize that we're playing on a warped pool table. And whether it's our fault or somebody else's fault really doesn't matter so much as realizing that's what we have to work with. And judgment cannot solve that problem. Spanking the spankers will not solve the problem. Only compassion will solve that problem. What Genesis is saying, I think it's easier to see through what Buddha says, but maybe it's easiest of all to see it in what Joni Mitchell says. We are stardust. We are golden. But we're caught in the devil's bargain. And we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Well, those